Hello, my name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a Senior Program Manager in SharePoint Engineering. This is the SharePoint Framework Client-Side Components section in the Getting Started with SharePoint Framework module. In this particular section, we'll have a closer look on what are third-party web parts and what are the tooling and how do you actually build them using the SharePoint Framework platform. We'll start with an overview, we'll have a quick look on the web parts, and then we'll have a demo, what the third-party web parts are and how they behave within a Office 365 tenant. SharePoint Framework components consist, for the time being, client-side web parts. We are looking into extending different set of additional components in the future, but when this video was recorded, the client-side web part was the only component type which is available. Client-side components and client-side web parts are providing the user experience. And you can use them in the modern page canvas. So modern page canvas is a big part of the modern experiences within SharePoint Online. You can use also client-side web parts in the classic pages, which is a great choice for modernizing your existing web parts or customizations, also in sites which are using classic experience in SharePoint Online. The implementation of client-side web parts is a JavaScript based, and you will be implementing them using TypeScript, which is then compiled or transcompiled to JavaScript for the browser execution. You will have access on the page content, and you have access on the different REST APIs and site data APIs to get information from SharePoint when you're doing the development and obviously when the web part is being used within the production. The client-side components or the client-side web parts are being packaged using the similar model as within the add-in model. So when you're packaging a client-side SharePoint Framework solution, it will be an SPPKG file, which is basically a similar kind of a file as adding components. These are getting deployed using the app catalog, which is a site collection created for tenants using a specific template, and that's where individual add-ins and SharePoint Framework solutions are getting published to be available within the tenant. When you create the components or when you create the client-side web parts, you're using Yeoman templates. So Yeoman templates are defining the basic structure for you as a kind of a starting point for client-side web part development. The actual build process is gulp-based, so you will be using a gulp-based tooling to create or package your components or test the components locally within your local workbench. There's technically two different versions of the SharePoint workbench. There's the local one, which will enable you to do development without connectivity on SharePoint Online. And then there's the SharePoint Online one, which will enable you to do debugging of your code within the context of SharePoint by hosting your client-side components still from your local host, which is a great tooling for doing development with client-side web parts. Let's have a quick, slightly more closer look on the client-side web parts and what they are and how they actually behave. So SharePoint client-side web parts are essentially almost like the classic web parts which we've been using in SharePoint in the past as well. They are configurable, reusable, and purpose-built components. What it means is that you can define what kind of properties and configurations these client-side web parts have, and you can configure them based on the instances placed on the page within a SharePoint. Framework for connecting related components means that within the SharePoint framework, you will have a framework for accessing all of the information within the SharePoint form. You can use the REST APIs or other options to access information in SharePoint, or even call external services using a specific specific access or specific implementations of calling those external REST endpoints or whatever external APIs. Client-side web parts are really meant to be for providing you a capability to add functionality to SharePoint UI. So you're able to deploy them within a tenant, and then they will be available for end users to consume within their pages within SharePoint site. They are aware of the context, so you can easily access information like who's actually using the web part. You can do personalized experiences based on that information, and they're aware of the context as in the site where they are being hosted. So they can, within the client-side web part, you can easily access information within the site. For example, information in a list or any other object type within a SharePoint site level. Client-side web parts are still web parts. They behave and they are like web parts which we've been using with SharePoint context for years. They are built with a modern JavaScript-driven web stack, which means that they are fluent, they're fast, they're much more performant than the classic web part implementations. And combining that with the modern experiences, with the modern pages and modern sites, the whole site is being much more faster, it's much more fluent, you can much more easily modify the site behaviors using the client-side web parts and all of the additional modern capabilities which are available. Client-side web parts run directly on the SharePoint page, and what it means is that they are not being exposed using an iframe like the adding model parts are exposed. And that's really the key difference here. So client-side web parts are essentially JavaScript which are being approved by the tenant administrator to be hosted within the context of the SharePoint page. A tenant administrator or a person who the tenant administrator has delegated the responsibility can approve a client-side web part to be available within a tenant, and then the end users can install that JavaScript-based implementation directly on the page. The add-in model was slightly different with adding client-side web add-in parts where the implementation was based on iframes, where the actual add-in content and the information within the add-in part was exposed using alternative URL. Let's have a closer look on the client-side web part development or custom client-side web parts in SharePoint. So we'll have a look on how they're being developed and also how they're getting deployed to the SharePoint Online and how they're getting exposed within the SharePoint Online for the end users. In this video, we'll have a look on what are custom client-side web parts in SharePoint Framework, how we can actually deploy them, how they work also in SharePoint Online. So let's have a quick look on at these sample web parts, which are available for you also from the GitHub. So we're going to use the React To Do Basic as the sample web part here as we move along and have a look on what does the web part solution actually contains, how do we configure that, how do we deploy that, and all of those details. So here's a React To Do web part. First of all, this web part is available from GitHub. So if you go to the SharePoint organization, so github.com/SharePoint, you can find SPDef web parts. And this is one of the locations where we are collecting both engineering and community samples. So samples which people are building and they want to share for the other people in a community from one single location. And this particular web part is the React To Do Basic web part. So if I drill into that one, this actually README file contains information how the web part actually works, how to get started, and it is in the GA version, so it's working properly right now. And also obviously what you need to do when you pull down the sample from a GitHub. And also additional details on the implementation styles, placeholders, and all of the additional details as well. Client-side web parts obviously also work in the classic pages. We'll have a look on that one in a second as well. And then you're able to configure them as you move along. Now, let's quickly have a look on this behavior first from the web part implementation in the Visual Studio Code side. So the web part itself is implemented using React, and it actually takes advantage of the Office UI Fabric components. And that gives you a consistent UI elements and the same controls what we use in the SharePoint Online natively from a Microsoft perspective. This is a React-based implementation, and what it means is that the actual render method, for example, in this particular web part, is relatively simple. The main thing what we do in the render method is that we're providing the needed configuration and properties from the property pane based on the user selection. Actual rendering of the items and rendering of the information happens then in the components. So in this case, we're creating a to-do container component, which is essentially the main component within this React web part. And to-do container then essentially is responsible of actually defining what are the placeholders and what is the rendering mechanism when we actually render the place and render the items in this case, because this is a to-do web part, when we render the items in the UI. And we use a few different smaller components here. So there's a custom to-do form component and custom to-do list component. And to-do list component also has to-do list item component. So for all of the items in the UI, we have a specific component. And this way you can more easily kind of split your code in the more understandable and maintainable pieces as well. Good. So let's quickly have a look on how do we actually use these web parts and this web part in practice within the UIs, and how do we actually also take this web part into use. So what does it mean when we have a custom web part and how we can host that within a SharePoint Online. So when the web part has been implemented, you're happy with the implementation and it works properly, or when you're doing the basic development as well, you can absolutely do Culp serve within which will essentially render this web part in a local workbench. And this will fire a browser. And in the browser session, let's see where we actually get the browser session ongoing. After a while, when the Culp serve is actually starting, we will open up a browser tab, in this case, that particular session. When we do the Culp serve, the engine actually compiles or transcompiles essentially the TypeScript to JavaScript. So in the browser, we are only executing JavaScript. The TypeScript is something what we use during development time to give us type checking and intelligence and all of that. So now we can see that we're in localhost 4321 and we're running a local workbench. And now I can actually take the to-do and play around with it. I can do live modifications. So as an example, now it's getting things done, organize and share your teams to do with your web part. So now if I need to go and do a modification on that, I can actually go and do that really easily. And in the development time, it's going to refresh that automatically as well. So here we have, let's see which one of these it is. So I'm flipping back on the UI, configure button. So let's see, there's the button label configure me, and let's update the changes. And what's going to happen now is that the development environment essentially understands that, hey, there's a change within my code, so therefore I will recompile my implementation, and I will also refresh this UI. So after a while, when the recompilation to JavaScript from transcript to JavaScript has been completed, this UI will refresh in any minute or any second now, and we can actually see the change being reflected in the UI as well. So now if we can see that it says configure me. So you will have this kind of a nice implementation, live implementation. You can see the changes in your local workbench extremely easily. In this particular web part, it's also showing mocking of the data because we are in localhost. We don't have to necessarily have access on SharePoint Online. So I can select a one list item, list 1, 2, and 3, and these are mocked data. Because the implementation, the code essentially has a different path if I'm being hosted in a local workbench or if I'm being hosted in SharePoint Online. Maybe a quick look on that one. Let's actually go to the web part. So to do web parts, and then let's have a look on where do we actually load the tasks. So load task list. Oh, that's the load task list. So let's go to the definition. And in here we have a data provider which is get list task lists. So let's go to that definition, and it's opening the data provider in here. So this is the interface of the data provider. The actual implementation is in here, and this is essentially then responsible of getting the live data, and you can have a look on how the live data is being received. Now, because we are in the local workbench, we're using the mock data provider. Essentially, we are generating some sample data, so we're able to mimic the behavior if we would be working against SharePoint Online. And that's just a simplistic checking if we are in the SharePoint Online or are we in the local workbench. Whenever the implementation is good enough and I want to actually start testing this in the connected way, I can actually move to the SharePoint Online. So right now, my environment is actually up and running. What I could do quite simply is that if I don't want the local workbench to get started, I can do something like following. Gulp serve -no browser. And this essentially, again, bundles the code, does all of the basic setup, but it doesn't start the local workbench. So it doesn't explicitly open up a new tab running in the local host, because we don't need that when we are hosting the web part from the SharePoint Online. So let's actually wait a while when the full compilation is completed in here, and then we can go to the SharePoint Online and host that custom web part in the SharePoint Online in a connected way. So there we go, configure Webpack. Compilation always depends also on the machine itself, so depending on your machine power and what's happening and all of that. But this doesn't take too long. It takes a while to always go through. But when you're doing the local workbench development, actually also SharePoint Online workbench development, you don't necessarily need to restart the machines or restart the running in a gulp, because if you refresh in the SharePoint Online, you'll get the latest version. If you're in SharePoint, the local workbench, you actually get the latest version by default automatically. So it's refreshing the local workbench when the serving is happening. So there we go, starting subtask serve, and we're pretty much ready to go. There's some final registrations, and then we are good to go for actually using the web part. So now if I go to my online workbench, which is available under any site collection or any site with an underscore layout and 15 in workbench, I can actually find this web part in here. So let me do a refresh. Just making sure that SharePoint Online Workbench ASPX file is catching up on my localhost reference. And now if we come here, I can actually see the to-do web part available within my SharePoint Online. And there we go, we can see the configure me, the changed value over there. And then if I go to the modify, we actually have a live behavior. So I can select activities as an example, which is a task list within this site. So let me actually show you that so you have a understanding how the linking works as well. So if I go to my developer site collection, it doesn't have to be a developer site collection. It can be a developer site collection. We can find activities list, which is a task list in here. And these are the tasks which we're also seeing in the SharePoint Online workbench. Because we are in the context of the site, we're able to query what lists and items are actually available. And then the web part is also showing simplistic kind of a saving of an item. So saving new task to the list as our to-do task, adding that one there, clicking add, and that's actually adding the item to the list. So it's executing the REST queries against the live data. So if we go to the activities list, refresh, and have a look on the latest. So let's actually do this. So let me scroll down, and there we go. Saving new task to the list has been added to the list. So we can actually find the new item here as well. And just as well, the web part. Let's go to the SharePoint Online one. I can absolutely delete some of this as well. So I can go and essentially delete that item as well by clicking the X, and that means that it's executing a delete operation against SharePoint Online. Good. So that's the basic setup for this particular web part. And this works now in the on-premises workbench or the local workbench and then SharePoint Online workbench. What do I need to do to get it actually deployed? So there's a few things. When we are ready with the web part, I can do some modifications. And this slightly, again, depends where are you going to host the web part. But in the SharePoint Framework, the SharePoint Framework web part, the JavaScript code isn't actually hosted in SharePoint. Or it can, but it doesn't necessarily have to be hosted in SharePoint. It should be hosted in CDN. The CDN could be in Azure CDN, it could be Office 365 CDN, or it could be on any other alternative location. So before we are ready to host this without the local Node.js being running in my machine, we need to configure write manifest JSON. And this essentially is defining the location for our manifest file where the JavaScript definitions actually are loaded from. In my case, I'm using Office 365 public CDN, so I'm actually referring to that public CDN URL, and then I have my test tenant URL, and then I should have a CDN folder there where we have a to-do web part folder. So let's go and double check that one out from the site as well. So let's go in here. We can see that we have a tenant, there's a CDN document library, and then I have a to-do web part folder where I actually have the files. So I've essentially copied the files, the output files from a temp dist folder to this location. To be able to use, again, these files in my tenant, I also need to get my app deployed. So how do we get the app deployed? When I'm doing a gulp package solution, I'm actually getting an SBKGB package, which I'm able to then install to my tenant. And that essentially means that the solution is available for the end users to use. And in this case, what I've done is that I've installed this solution explicitly to my root site. So if I go to the site contents, we can see that SharePoint Framework solution to be installed on the site or to be available within the site. At the time this video is being recorded, this is how we ensure that the web part is being visible within a site. So we need to actually get the SharePoint Framework solution deployed. We're planning in engineering a few other options on this one, so the situation slightly might have changed depending when you're watching this video. To make it easier, right now you basically need to go and add an app and then install the SharePoint Framework solution to the site so that the web part is available within the site context. But when it's available in the site context, let's actually go here. Let's stop my local Node.js, so that's not running. If the configurations are correct, when we create a new page in the site, and there we go, we kind of use right now first the modern page. So if I go to the web part picker and scroll down, I can actually still see my to-do web part. And the reason why I'm seeing this is that because I've deployed that SBBKG package to my app catalog, or it has been deployed by the tenant administrator, or a person to whom tenant administrator has delegated the permissions to do that. So let's add that web part on a page. And we can actually see the implementation here as well. The configure me option isn't here because I deployed this slightly earlier using the Office 365 CDN. I'm not going to go all the steps through on the Office 365 CDN setup. We have other videos for that one as well. But you can see that this web part is running. There's no task lists in the site, so it can't actually do the connection. So we can actually go to the site contents. And let's create a new task list so we can double check that everything is working properly. So let's come in here. Let's click the new button when the new button comes here. There we go. Well, since we are creating a task list, it's under the apps, not a list. It's rather an app because it has functionalities on it. So here, let's create a task list. Let's give it a name, something like to-dos. And now we have a to-do list here. So let's actually create a new page on the site. And now when we add a new page and add a web part on the page itself, we can actually see that it's working against that to-do list, or we can configure that to be working against the to-do list. So there we go. And we can actually start adding tasks, which would be then reflected or added on that actual list. The one thing what I wanted to also quickly show here is how to create a classic page. So if I come here and if I go to, or how to use the web parts that they are visible in the classic pages as well. And let's go to the site pages and let's actually create a classic page on this site. So when the new button, here's the new button, and let's create a web part page, not a site page, rather a web part page. So this is a classic page, actually, I didn't want to create a web part page. Well, just as well, I could actually create a web part page as well. But let's go one version back, not the full 2 versions back. So let's actually create a, let's go to the site pages list. And let's actually create a wiki page. That's the normal 2013 kind of a page. Not a modern page, but the wiki page. So let's call this wiki page. And adding that page on the site. And now if we go to the insert in the ribbon, we can go to the web part selection. And in the web part selection, because I didn't actually change any of the default settings, that to-do web part is available under the development section. And this is a really important thing to realize as well. So you can use modern web parts in classic experience as well. So these work perfectly fine in the classic experience. And now I can actually go and do edit web part. And we can still do the full configuration on this side as well. So if I click the configure button, it actually shows the modern property pane on the right side. So you will first see the classic web part settings on the right side, but then if I click the configure, you can actually see the modern web part behavior here as well. And then you're able to, in this case, you're able to select the to-dos if you want to do so. Really important thing, because now that you can use the modern client-side web parts also in classic pages, also your classic portals and classic collaboration sites to provide you a more streamlined and faster experience as well. But that's all we're going to do within this video. So walking through what is a custom web part, how do we develop that, how do we configure that, how do we quickly kind of walk through what does it mean when we are deploying that to be available. In this case, we used Office 365 CDN, but it could be any other CDN hosting those scripts files outside of SharePoint. Office 365 CDN means that they're being hosted still from SharePoint, but using anonymous access point through the CDN functionality. But I think that's enough for walking through the basic setup for third-party web parts. In this section, we went through a quick overview on the client-side web parts and talked about what they are and what's the differences between client-side web parts and add-in model. We also had a demo walking through the development experience with client-side web parts and also how to get them deployed on the tenant itself. If you're looking more detailed on the SharePoint Framework development guidance for SharePoint Online or on-premises, we would highly recommend using the SharePoint Patterns and Practices assets. SharePoint Patterns and Practices is a community-driven initiative coordinated by SharePoint Engineering, which provides together with engineering and community, code samples and solutions, reusable components, guidance documentations. We have community calls. The areas are in SharePoint Framework, SharePoint Add-in Model, Microsoft Graph, and Office 365 API. AKMS, SharePoint PnP is the one address to remember. Thank you for watching.